The planet's puppet masters almost surely have a plan. There's clearly maybe something there beyond the realm of man. And until you've thoroughly tested every last close-justed view, I find the more you think you know, the less you really do.
That's true, Dr. Zayas. Very well.
Where would we be without THC? 'Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Yeah, where would we be without THC? The Higher Side Chat Show, Greg Carwood and Company.
How's it going, Higher Side Chatters? Drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke, and working to wash away the residue of consensus reality so I can properly think on the wavelength required for me to do what I do. From sunny San Diego, I'm Greg Carlwood, and this right here is a hell of a show. Many of you might be familiar with the electric universe concept. Many of you probably aren't, but this is an interesting paradigm change from the way we typically think of space and the universe, because mainstream science really only tells us that one force rules the cosmos, and that's gravity. And we have the lens that is the theory of relativity of which we must look through, and we're told our sun operates as what they might be giants so accurately described as a gigantic nuclear furnace. But the more we learn about and observe things beyond our little rock, the more we find long-held scientific dogma needs an update, and big pieces of the puzzle are missing. While the electric universe model and this idea that electricity rather than gravity could be the primary operator, the main mojo behind the formation of worlds and the fuel of stars. Well, they have huge implications, and they tie into a lot of other areas we talk about in the alternative world, but on a more fundamental scale. Exciting stuff, but I wanted to give some of you a bit of a basis for this show because it is a different view of the world that takes a little context to understand, but David does it better than I, so let's just dive into it. The electric universe, the Saturn-Sun swap, the mythological reconstruction, the polar configuration, and more. Enjoy. Alright people, it's no secret we enjoy pointing out the holes in the things we take for granted and find it useful to always remain skeptical of the official story, the consensus perspective, or in today's case, the settled science. And of all the topics we explore, what could be more impactful than reworking our understanding of the galactic environment, space, and the universe itself? Well, this is the realm of which today's guest is here to challenge the status quo, but also to outline what's called the electric universe model, a paradigm that makes sense of many of the holes left by the traditional explanations, clarifies art and writing from the ancient past, and quite possibly could give some underlying context for certain occult symbolism and conspiratorial themes we know all too well. It's a big can of worms, but David Talbott is just the man to pop the top. David is the founder and director of the popular Thunderbolts Project, which is the main group promoting the electric universe model currently. He's also written and co-written several books, including The Saturn Myth, The Electric Universe, and Thunderbolts of the Gods, as well as produced the popular Symbols of an Alien Sky documentary series, a guest and topic I've been looking forward to for a while now, a brilliant mind in troubled times. David, my man, welcome to THC.
Okay, very good, Greg. Set me up, why don't you?
That's my job.
Okay, well, no, I appreciate that. So I'm ready.
Yeah, man, thanks for being here. I do find this electric universe model fascinating. It has popped up here and there over the years, but I'm looking forward to diving into the details with someone who really knows this stuff well. Of course, it's been getting more popular every year, but just so we leave no man behind, to kind of kick this thing off,
Yes, indeed.
Introduce us to the electric universe model and how it's different than our common understanding of things.
Well, the first thing I would say about the electric universe community as a whole, since the electric universe model is really being clarified through contributions from a wide range of interdisciplinary investigations, because it is so broad in its sweeping implications, it requires us to think in interdisciplinary terms about origins, the interconnections of physical origins to things that have come down to us from a more antique world, the archaic world of myths and symbols. They all get entwined in a picture of space, the remote events we observe in the universe on the one hand, and things occurring closer to home, perhaps only a few thousand years ago, and affecting humanity around the world. The practical pathway that led first and foremost to a sense of an electric universe community just happened to be my own convergence with the Australian physicist Wal Thornhill.
Mm-hmm.
My background was particularly in the study of ancient myths and symbols. My book, The Saturn Myth, was published by Doubleday many years ago, 1980. That book slowly acquired a following. This is actually over decades. It acquired a following, and one individual who became vitally interested in the Saturn myth was the Australian physicist Wal Thornhill. That was the beginning then of a progressive alignment of our interests. And eventually we became close colleagues, and we share the stage at many conferences and so on, as we have for perhaps 20 years or more.
Mm-hmm.
And Wal Thornhill spent his entire adult life investigating the physics of electricity at all scales of observation. He's a very well-rounded expert on the electric universe. The surprise for me was that when he saw what I had reconstructed on the basis of ancient testimony alone, he said to me, "Dave, you have described perfectly electric discharge formations in a plasma environment." I can tell you, I didn't even know, due to the narrowness of my historical investigation, I didn't really know what a plasma is sufficiently to define it or to describe it scientifically at that time. But that was the beginning of this progressive collaboration between Wal and me. That has just continued to grow and has attracted a lot of people internationally. The electric universe movement today is very international. And when we put on a conference, we attract people from around the world, and our speakers come from several different countries typically. And it's making for a sense progressively emerging today of an undeniable movement.
Mm-hmm.
The electric universe is a movement today. It is proving very persuasive to people who will take the time to look.
Mm-hmm.
And all I ask of people is, if they begin searching on this, is to do the best they can to distinguish between the people who have really looked and those who have just simply reacted from a prior ideological vantage point, because it's a huge divide today.
Right.
We're very happy, though, with the responses we get whenever someone comes openly from a very skilled scientific background and looks at the evidence that we've assembled under this heading of the electric universe.
Yeah, I find this fascinating, and I love that it is gaining steam and becoming a real movement. But what is it that's being proposed here? It's primarily, I guess, to sum it up in a nutshell, it's that electricity is more of the driving force of the universe than gravity, right?
Well, that statement is susceptible possibly to confusion, but there's a fundamental truth in that. One reason for the claim within our group that electricity is prior or more fundamental is that even gravity can be reduced down to a nuance at the quantum level, at the subatomic level. Structure of charged particles have to do directly with the origins of gravitational fields. So gravity is not a fundamental force in the views of the electric universe theorists. It is an elementary force that depends on the subatomic role of the electric force in distortions of charged particles, producing an aggregate effect we call gravity. Now, this is, I would have to say, just far enough from my own expertise. if I say about another paragraph on this, I'll probably begin misstating things, just so there's no misunderstanding here. The gravity question runs very deep in conversations that have gone on for years. And I would not be the one to speak for the electrical interpretation of gravity. Wal Thornhill is splendid. He's my partner, the Australian physicist. He is splendid in describing the contribution of the electric force to the effects that we call gravity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, well, let's say this. I borrowed the term settled science in the intro from one of your presentations entitled Exposing the Myths of Settled Science. And I really like that title, and it's really one of my favorite things to do. And in this area, what does this electric universe paradigm correct? What are the holes in what we are taught in school that tell us that some things need reworking, and this model might do that?
Okay, well, I'll skip over a number of things inadvertently, but I mean, if you go to the most fundamental question that would be asked at the macrocosm, the biggest picture we have of the universe, the fundamental challenge that we are registering comes from evidence that electric currents are moving across the macrocosm. In other words, interplanetary, interstellar, and intergalactic electric currents, that's motions of charged particles in space, are producing electric fields and producing structures in space ranging from galaxies down to star formation, down to planet formation, down to comets and asteroids moving through the plasma environment of the sun, where comets are moving through, because of their elliptical orbits, an electric field of the sun, which is the reason why comets will tend to discharge at a critical juncture, and asteroids tend not to produce comet-like displays. So there's a picture here of the fundamental role of the electric force, what is creating an exotic structure of a galaxy with its stupendously energetic jets, for example. Mm-hmm. Well, we are saying that galaxy is not being structured simply by forces internal to that organized mass. It is being affected by the vast volume of electric charge in which it is embedded. So a star within a galaxy is just a little dust mote, as we say, because if you place a particle of dust at one end of a block and another particle of dust at the other end of the block, how much dynamic activity between those two particles of dust is going to produce the effect we see on a galactic scale. In other words, scaling up from those two particles of dust to stars in a galaxy, those stars do not have the inherent power to produce galactic structure without the contribution of that larger electric field. The galaxy is itself just the tiniest speck when set against the electromagnetic emissions that we now observe in radio galaxies, for example. So we cannot ignore the contribution of this vast sea of plasma around galaxies to the formation of galaxies. In the same way, the origins of stars along these luminous filaments that we now observe telescopically within the Milky Way, those stars are being formed by the natural, well-documented pinch effect of plasma streams. And the result is an explosion into life of a star in a star-forming region in a galaxy. So all of this involves looking to the larger domain to help explain what you see at smaller scales. There are no islands in space. Mm-hmm. No star was ever born of its own accord. It was always an effect of a vastly larger electrical contribution. It's almost unfathomable, this volume of space, three-dimensionally. That volume, I mean, just across interplanetary distances out to the heliosphere, it's just a stupendous figure. And that entire volume is capable of contributing square foot by square foot, this most minuscule addition to the electric field of the sun. But in aggregate, there's power there to light the sun. So we challenge the idea that the sun is just a thermonuclear furnace.
Right.
There would not be a sun, we say, were it not for the plasma environment that is helping or maybe even exclusively responsible for the lighting of the sun.
Yeah, and I like when you say that there are no islands in space. I've heard you say that it's better to think of stars or systems as beads on a string. And I think that's a good visualization to show maybe things are more interconnected than we're led to believe out there.
Well put. That's a very nice observation with respect to what we now see telescopically as we look into the heart of the Milky Way galaxy, our home galaxy. We see these very dynamic filaments. The filaments themselves are wider than our heliosphere. In other words, wider than the distance from one end of our sun's domain to the opposite end of the sun's domain, way out past the planet. So that's room, or that's volume, to hold this massive electrical potential. That's what we are seeing acting to create the mysterious, the highly enigmatic behavior of our own sun. We can just look at the sun in all of its mysterious attributes and begin naming the attributes that point to an external influence. It's not being driven by a thermonuclear furnace. It's being driven by this subtle energy that the volume of the heliosphere is more than sufficient to light the sun. And we simply look then for evidence to what we call the interfacial boundaries. Mm-hmm. The sun is a discrete body in space. It's responding to an external electrical environment. So the theoretical question becomes, is there interfacial dynamic activity suggestive of that transaction electrically between the body of the sun and its larger environment? And when you go to the boundary conditions, you see evidence of spectacular electrical transactional activity. As you go upward from the surface of the sun, you go to higher temperatures and more dynamic charged particle interactions. Well, that's exactly what an external electrical environment would predict there. Mm-hmm. If you look beneath the visible surface of the sun to the layer just beneath the visible surface that is exposed at sunspots, you see that the sunspot is anchored in a slower moving region. And you see above the surface of the sun, the plasma environment is rotating faster than the surface. In other words, move out from the sun, you are moving into rotational velocities that are the opposite of what you would expect if the sun were being driven from its core. Does that make sense? You stir a pond from the center, it will never move around faster at its periphery.
Yeah.
But that's what we see with the sun. It's being acted upon by its plasma environment. And so every test that we can name of the electric sun hypothesis is actually being measured now by the closer attention that is given to the sun today by NASA and other solar physicists.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It can get kind of complex, but it's kind of contradictory to what we're told in school, which is that space is an empty void and it's a largely dead universe with little pockets of life on these bare, sparse planets. But it seems like if we're talking about an electrical field, like a charged blanket in space, maybe it should be thought of as not so dead, not so void and empty.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we have concluded about the environment of the sun. To attempt to understand the sun as an island in space is to actually miss the opportunity to one by one address the anomalous attributes of the sun. I mean, we've tried to make this point so many times, but it still stands that all of the defining attributes of the sun, apart from it being big and bright, well, back up. Apart from it being big, because the brightness is the question at stake here, all of those attributes are anomalous. There are so few things that you can say about the sun that don't arise as anomalies within solar physics. But I can tell you, even as it may sound overconfident to people, I have not observed in the history of the electric universe movement any findings about the sun that would come as a surprise to an electrical theorist. So yes, of course, charged particles are accelerated away from the sun. And not just some short distance, but they're still accelerating when they get past the Earth. So something's acting on these little charged particles.
Right.
As we say, they're not little rocket ships, folks. And what that means is that to understand the sun, you could never afford to just ignore the explicit indications of this electric field. You can take the power of acceleration from the sun and on outward, and mathematically, I'm quite confident, though I wouldn't be the one to do it, mathematically calculate the scale of that electric field, the strength of that electric field at all of the different distances from the sun. Charged particles from the sun racing outward at hundreds of thousands of miles per hour and then continuing to accelerate. This is what an electric field does.
Yeah.
But how much attention have the peer-reviewed journals on solar physics given to the contribution of the external environment of the sun to the behavior we observe at the surface of the sun?
Yeah. They're still pushing this idea of a thermonuclear reactor. Have they just missed something, or is there intentional deception? Is there a reason they want us to think one way and not in this new way, or is it just an unfortunate situation?
Well, it is unfortunate because it costs us billions of dollars in science asking the wrong questions. Because if they're not really concerned about the forces acting on the surface of the sun from outside the sun, that will mean that the cost to countries around the world would have to be counted in billions of dollars. And that cost just goes on and on. So how do we explain this? I do not believe that we can attribute this to deliberate deception, except in one sense. And I would call it the momentum of prior beliefs. There is a kind of deliberate attachment to our prior beliefs. And that's where the cost to science originates, when we ignore the electrical contribution to the activity of the sun and to other bodies in space. Breaking that momentum of prior belief is a tremendous challenge, because what it will appear to a proponent of the standard doctrine, it will appear as if we're asking him to believe things that have been completely excluded by real science. They do actually exhibit this confidence. But this is the nature of scientific revolutions. It appears to those defending the orthodoxy, it appears as if the people who are challenging them are half crazy.
Right.
They just didn't learn what they learned in school. And so we'll get tutored all the time on stuff that they learned in school as if we'd never heard of such a thing.
Right. And On that subject, apparently there have been a lot of brilliant minds throughout history who have recognized this electrical component in some way. They've just kind of been marginalized, right?
Well, I think that's probably the defining characteristic of scientific revolutions is that they don't come easily. It's just too easy to dismiss a novel idea. But what is happening today is that a large number of well-qualified people are seeing the persuasive argument coming out of the electric universe community. I mean, we've had almost 10 million views of our YouTube channels. Okay, that's YouTube. And not quite a set of peer-reviewed journals, but for those who will look, they'll come to understand why the electric universe has not received due attention from peer-reviewed science. This takes time. What is occurring now is that independent scientists are beginning to ask questions. We're getting quite a crowd of scientists coming into our group now, and some of the better ones will be speaking at our conferences this year. And the upshot of this is that the revolution is actually already underway. I would go so far to say, Greg, this is perhaps it would be seen as pretentiousness on our part, but I believe based on what science has already come to acknowledge out of the surprises of the space age and so on, we've already moved into and maybe substantially through the tipping point. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, the tipping point was a theme, the title of our conference just 2 years ago, because people were beginning to comment on this. Well, it looks like we're reaching the tipping point now, because people can hold in their minds as they move forward from an original skepticism they might have taken toward the EU. They hold in their minds what you should expect to find if there's substance to the EU. Mm-hmm. And so they begin to notice. It's like comets drifting in toward the sun, beginning to discharge electrically. Well, that's the prediction, of course, of the electric comet model. If the sun has an electric field, a body moving from the outer reaches of the sun's influence into the sun, a body of sufficient size that it can hold its charge from that remote region, it's going to be under increasing electrical stresses as it approaches the sun. But what does a body do when it's under electrical stress? There's a critical juncture at which it begins to discharge electrically because it can't be relieved of that stress by any other means. That, we've been saying, is what a comet is doing as it is falling toward the sun. Well, that sets up all kinds of predictions if people will follow them. And this is where comet science is headed now. Mm-hmm. Every year that goes by, we are seeing more clearly defined electrical attributes of comets, suggesting that these bodies are indeed charged objects in space, and the stresses on these bodies are causing the cometary displays. I'm talking about the electrical stresses that comes from a charged body being placed in a plasma or other environment of a different charge. This is the fundamental nature of cometary activity, we believe.
Mm-hmm. I actually like that section of the research because I was listening to you in a previous interview talk about, of course, comets are traditionally thought of as icy snowballs, and apparently with the recent comets that we've seen, there have been some discrepancies because I guess, if I understood you correctly, the pattern that it makes in the sky looks very large, and so they have to attribute a larger size to the object out in space, but there seems to be some inconsistencies because they're trying to account for, I guess, the brightness of it or the way it looks from the surface of the Earth, because they're not taking into account this electrical component. Is that kind of accurate?
That is a possible effect on the rational thinking of comet scientists, where they're trying to deduce the size of the body from the amount of, let's say, gases that they're presuming must be sublimating from a surface of a particular size, since out at the more remote regions where these bodies begin to exhibit these cometary displays, if it were just an effect of solar heating, it would take a larger surface.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it would take a larger surface that actually shows up when we see a comet more up close and personal. So what is occurring here is an inherent contradiction in the assumption that cometary displays are produced by heating from the sun.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've had comets begin discharging out past the orbit of Jupiter. Well, if that's the basis of a cometary display, why aren't the icy bodies in Jupiter's domain exhibiting that same kind of sublimation process?
Good point.
It's not sublimation at all. It's not evaporation of gases under the heating of the sun. It's a body that is just large enough to hold on to its prior charge as it is moving into a region of different charge. This is so reasonable. It's such a reasonable hypothesis. Well, now, Greg, I can tell you that there are scientists who are very well qualified in their fields looking at comets now. And one I really want to highlight is Dr. Franklin Anariba. He's very well informed on the electrochemistry of water formation in comets. When we see water in a cometary atmosphere, the coma of a comet, we just assumed that there has to be water on the surface. Where else would it come from? Well, Dr. Anariba has shown with great precision that electrical activity on a surface of silicates can produce water. And he reviews the evidence that this is exactly what is happening in some or most or all of the comets that we've subjected to closer investigation, let's say. And incidentally, his article is getting excellent responses from people communicating with us privately. We've just put it up. And if people will go to the Thunderbolts Project website, thunderbolts.info, go to the Thunder blog pages, the very last article listed in our Thunder blogs pages is by Dr. Anariba. It is an incredibly compelling picture of the electric comet.
Yeah, it's a fascinating sector of this research for sure. And let me ask you, because a layman might be listening here and they might not see these distinctions as a big deal. Okay, so comets have an electrical charge and the universe is electric rather than an empty void. So what? What are the implications of that for someone who might not fully grasp it yet?
Yeah, perfectly reasonable question there, Greg, and we have to deal with this all the time. we understand that it may not be crystal clear that there are huge implications. We're actually touched by the implications all the time, including when we pay our taxes. In other words, we just assume that when taxes go to education, that education is serving a useful purpose.
Yeah, good point.
Well, actually, if education is perpetuating misinformation and costing us eventually billions of dollars to correct misdirections in the sciences, well, this should be of interest to everyone. But that's really still a little bit too theoretical, I think, for most people. I can tell you this, that if people will look closely at the electric universe, it is so interdisciplinary. If they are still intellectually alive, they will find points of great interest here. A comet is an electrical phenomena, is one point of interest. Another point of interest is that the ancient sky of observers on Earth was a spectacular display of electrical activity. And that you could not begin to understand the origins of the ancient cultures, their mythic themes, their symbols, and so on, apart from this activity. Now, this is so unknown, and yet it attracts people so strongly. Our most popular video, it's around, it's exceeded 1 million views, actually, is Symbols of an Alien Sky. Its subject is the things that our early ancestors witnessed in the sky in a time of stupendous planetary instability. And if you ever wonder where doomsday anxiety has come from culturally, or where the great myths and symbols came from, what was it that was acting on human imagination in that earlier time? You will have an interest in this material. We work with facts and the implications of facts. Mm-hmm. And people who will look and do want to know are finding this immensely persuasive.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a lot to this idea when you put it in that mythological context, which I know is your forte, and anyone interested should watch Symbols of an Alien Sky. A lot of it is visual, and you do a great job making that case. But if we're to assume the ancients were seeing these massive displays of electric plasma discharge in the atmosphere, why don't we see that anymore?
Well, the entire planetary arrangement has changed. And I should emphasize here, because it can be a sensitive point with people. We take ancient testimony seriously, but we apply ground rules for drawing reliable conclusions from human testimony. Mm-hmm. The very fact that we do work with ancient myths and symbols, that is a disqualifying consideration for people who have not actually approached this subject through our own work. And you can understand why we get this response. Well, you were just talking about myths. No, we're talking about the origins of myths worldwide, where there must be, it is a rational certainty that you can't get all of these recurrent themes around the world where different symbols and different words actually describe the same experiences, the same forms in the sky. You literally cannot get that accord without a celestial referent, a celestial event capable of provoking this amazing agreement of the different cultures. And we can identify hundreds of points of agreement. This is what the mythic archetypes are all about, a coherent substructure of human memory reconstructed by the points of agreement between the different cultures, different words and different symbols and different mythic interpretations actually pointing to exactly the same global experience.
Yeah, it's a huge can of worms for sure. And you're right about myths. I mean, myths, we just call them that because they're things that were dismissed because they weren't understood and they're just assumed to have been made up. But you do a great job making the case that a lot of the petroglyphs and ancient symbols found around the world amongst cultures that aren't supposed to be in contact at all, they have the same symbols. You know, why? You know, apparently they were drawing the electrical plasma discharge patterns that were seen in the sky during this time of radical change that are also consistent with what modern science knows about the way electricity and plasma acts in a vacuum. It would create these similar patterns, right?
Well, I'll tell you this, Greg. I've had a number of interviews over the past 20 years, but one thing I'm pleased to see, don't take this just as flattery, but I'm very pleased to see that you've actually been paying attention. So we're not just having a fireside chat with somebody who wants to know what the electric universe is about. You've actually paid enough attention that you can ask these questions. And honestly, that means a lot to me because it saves a tremendous amount of time and effort.
Well, I try. It's tough, yeah, but I try.
Okay, but you mentioned Tony Peratt. So let's just talk about Peratt for a few minutes. Because of all of the, the critical junctures that I could name wherein certain advances were made within the ideas of the electric universe. A personal convergence with Tony Peratt occurred about 15 years ago, and contributed mightily to my own confidence that an ultimate synthesis between the sciences and the electric universe and the ancient human experience, that this grand synthesis is actually possible. So I met Tony Peratt, who was probably the world's leading plasma scientist. This is an expert on the charged particle behavior in the plasma environment across the universe.
Mm-hmm.
All of the galaxies and stars and all of that are immersed in this sea of charged particles we call plasma. So we were interested in getting to know Tony Peratt from Los Alamos Laboratories back in 2000, and he came to our conference. And we were stunned by his response. He saw the formations that I had reconstructed, and he immediately recognized them as formations that he had when the program was still classified at Los Alamos Laboratories, no longer classified, but he had documented these very explicit, exotic configurations in the laboratory. And he had documented the evolution of these configurations in the laboratory. Both the structures and the evolution of the configurations matched what I had reconstructed only on the basis of human testimony. That meant stories around the world, myths and symbols around the world, pictures carved on stone, great monuments, ritual practices from one culture to another, all of these practices being commemorative of who knows what. What were they commemorating? Well, I was delivering an answer to that question that completely persuaded Tony Peratt. And as a result of that, he spent several years traveling the world and documenting electric discharge formations carved on stone by artists around the world who were responding to formations in the sky from different vantage points on Earth. That gave him an opportunity to do GPS positioning and to show in three-dimensional computer simulations that they were seeing the same forms in the sky.
Wow.
This was a tremendous breakthrough for us. Now, it's unfortunate that stories like this in the history of science often take you into rather controversial and disturbing trends in the sciences or characteristics of scientific revolutions and so on, because Tony Peratt came under horrific pressures at his place of employment. I'm always tempted to start giving names, but I actually don't want to do that because I think it just makes people more angry.
Right.
The thing is that Tony Peratt was effectively shut down. And it was just a tragedy because he had this exceptional ability to grab a hold of an idea, an exceptional desire, wanting to know, and going out and finding out for himself. We didn't influence him one bit in his work, but what he said to me was that he had proved beyond a shadow of a doubt from his own investigations that what I had reconstructed was absolutely on the right track. And these formations were seen in the sky, were carved on stone, and can be demonstrated through computer simulations. Before he had completed publication of his work, he was already shut down.
Damn. Man, we see that time and time again. So people were seeing these radical changes in the sky, these the effects of these radical changes in the solar system. And let's talk about what those radical changes were. This kind of gets us into the Saturn sun stuff. And this is really is really where the electric universe has come up most with previous guests of mine. There seems to be a lot of symbolism in occult circles and powerful secret societies and in Hollywood, which a lot of people see these as interconnected anyway. But for my money, this Saturn sun hypothesis has been the most compelling argument for why some of this stuff exists. This idea that Saturn, not the sun, was our original star, it's very out there, but how could this have been possible?
Well, it's interesting that you pose that question while I'm looking at your icon here a little bit more studiously, the higher side chats, and I see that you have absorbed some of this ancient imagery rather well.
That's true. Some of it's there.
And that actually is quite fascinating to me. Well, the Sun and Saturn equation, this is very close to the core, actually, of a revolutionary reconsideration of the ancient sky. I mean, partly it's close to the core because it's so fundamental to a reconsideration of what was on the minds of the first stargazers. When we look to the birthplace of astronomy, we'll generally go back to ancient Mesopotamia. And that Mesopotamia was kind of the birthplace of observational astronomy. They began to actually observe and record planetary motions. Now, this is thousands of years after the first stirrings of civilization, quite frankly, but something had come down to them through their traditions about planets. So they preserved lots of archaic traditions about the planets that they were now observing on their very regular or almost fully regular orbits in the first millennium BC, particularly, I think, after maybe 800 BC. What in the name of heaven was it that they were so driven to remember about these bodies, to preserve this symbolism? Now, first and foremost, there are these ridiculous, seemingly ridiculous ideas about the planet Saturn.
Right.
It was given the name of sun, the sun god, Shamash. When the astronomers looked at our sun in late times, they knew perfectly well that their language was giving this body we call sun, was giving it the name Shamash. But the curiosity is this huge echo from a more remote time when Shamash was the name of the planet Saturn. Now, why was that? This ambiguity between the sun that we see in the sky as this bright blast of light and a remote planet. There is no meaningful interpretation of that within our theoretical frameworks today. But when you begin to see that one ancient community after another preserved the same story of Saturn as this ancient sun god, I mean, Helios is always thought of as the sun, the Greek Helios. It was originally the name for the planet Saturn. Nobody disputes this. But why? There has to be a reason for things. The Latin Sol was originally the name of Saturn, not the sun. And scholars have been posing this mystery for maybe 150 years, maybe a little more. They recognize that the mystery has no easily explained origins. But what if we just ask whether the solar system has changed, the planetary system has changed? How much of such, or how many such unsolved mysteries would find an explanation? And my assertion today is that all of the mysteries are resolved. It's not a small matter. It's not a partial solution. It is possible by limiting your attention to the points of agreement between the different cultures, not seeking to resolve all of the finite contradictions and so on within particular cultures, but simply explain the global patterns, the archetypes, the points of convergence between the different cultures, where you can see that they are using different languages and different symbols to describe the same thing. Well, what happens then to our confidence in the uneventful solar system? It just evaporates on us. We go to a new frame of reference and we let the ancient accord guide our attention to the different patterns. And then everything makes sense. I will, after decades of investigating this fundamental question, I will say with highest confidence that every recurrent pattern globally is connected vitally, connected inseparably to every other global pattern. It's one story, one tapestry of human experience that has nothing to do with our sky today. So every attempt to understand the ancient world in terms of things we observe today is doomed to failure. No possibility. But take the issues up one at a time. I mean, I've challenged people in the past to name 2 or 3 recurrent themes of world mythology, recurrent archetypes, and I can now, in confidence, name the connections between them. These connections can then be examined and can be confirmed.
Right. Before we do run out of time, I got a couple more questions I want to fit in if we could. And you can answer them quickly, if you want. Yes. I mean, I'm not on a strict time limit, but
okay, that's good.
I'm curious if you have any indications in this work of if the moon was in its place before the Golden Age or if that came after the cataclysm.
Well, again, that's an interesting question, Greg. And the challenge is to avoid speculation. See, I have been advising people for years not to jump to any conclusions other than what follows inescapably from evidence that we can name, that we have in hand. You can't have these traditions without a celestial provocation. Okay, well, how do we deal with something like, well, I want to know whether the moon was a part of this planetary arrangement. Mm-hmm. Well, I looked for the moon up and down the libraries in the 1970s and so on, and I thought I found lots of references to the moon. The problem was that as I looked more closely, I saw, well, wait a minute, that's not the moon. It's a crescent, but it's not behaving like the moon. It's actually revolving around the polar center of the sky in a cycle of day and night. It's below in the phase of growing bright. It's above in the phase of growing dim. I talk about this a fair amount in our recent video material, Discourses on an Alien Sky. But that crescent in the famous star and crescent image, for example, of the ancient world, that had nothing to do with the moon.
Yeah.
So I can't find the moon. I can't. I mean, as far as I can tell, the moon wasn't seen. It wasn't in the theater of the gods that was fixed at the celestial pole.
Yeah.
So I suspect we didn't see it, Greg. I suspect that the plasma environment around the Earth, let's just say around and substantially a broad donut-like torus around the equator of the Earth would have occluded any image of the moon at all. And I just suspect it gradually appeared uneventfully over hundreds or thousands of years. It was never a subject of myth. But the story of this great spectacular crescent of day and night, that crescent gave its name and its mythic history to our moon as it did clarify over time. That created a huge confusion.
Interesting. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, to me, it's reasonable to think that the moon would have gotten into its orbit during this cataclysm. I mean, we're talking about something as extreme as the sun and Saturn, having some type of switch off. I mean, it's not really implausible that a little rock would also have some type of change in that environment also. But another question I wanted to ask you, so how do black holes fit into this paradigm? Do they exist at all in the electric universe model?
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. Now that's a shift, which I appreciate. Yeah.
It is.
It is a shift. Now, just a second. It takes a minute for my mind to go there. All right. Now it's there. So black holes are a mathematical contrivance. That's what bothers people in our group. What we do know with certainty is that there's a huge attractive force at the cores of galaxies. You can look at the stars that over, 20 years or so have been pretty well documented telescopically close to the center of rotation of our galaxy. And they follow paths that are very like comets wandering in from the extremes and then whipping past the sun and so on, and then zipping back out. So some of these bodies, stars we've seen only in partial glimpses of their circuits over years, because it's going to take more than the time of the observations and so on to complete the picture of their full circuit, much longer in some cases. But that the fact that they come in and zip around the sun is zip around the center of the galaxy it's very telling. There is a hugely powerful center of gravity at the core of the Milky Way.
Right on.
This has to be explained.
Yeah.
Now, Paul Thornhill's never denied that, for example. He just doesn't call it a black hole. He thinks of it in electrical terms, a plasma focus device. He's got a very good argument for what's going on at the center of galaxies, and it fits perfectly with something we see that has no explanation under the black hole idea, which is the galactic jet. Galactic jets are phenomenal, seemingly inconceivable streams of material up along the axes of galaxies out into surrounding space without dissipating. They don't dissipate as gases in a vacuum. Something is holding them into this tight linear configuration. Well, that's what electric currents do. It's an electric phenomenon. And now peer-reviewed papers are beginning to appear to address the electric qualities of galactic jets.
That's interesting, man. I love it.
It's all fascinating, and the future of the electric universe movement as a whole, I think, is just incredibly bright.
Yeah.
All that's necessary is that we maintain our sanity and don't get don't get into too many arguments and just keep going with the community's work.
Well, here's another random one for you. What does the electric universe model propose, or does it propose any differences to what would happen to a human in space as opposed to what the movies show, where people freeze really quickly or something like that? Because when we're talking about the fabric of space being different, I wonder if it would have a different effect on a human body.
I'd be surprised if there is much of a disparity here with common opinion, because a vacuum is a vacuum. And,
death is death, right?
Yeah. And don't try to breathe because you won't get very far. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense, but I figured it was worth asking.
No, that's fine. I never object to questions of this sort, Greg. Sometimes we dispense with them in ways that may seem a little cavalier, but the picture we would have of the vacuum of space would differ from the norm, maybe only in this sense that we believe that over large distances, the charged particles that are present in that vacuum, however sparse, those charged particles across the vacuum of space, interstellar space, intergalactic space, and so on, that power is unimaginable.
Yeah, a lot more serious than sticking a fork in a light socket.
Yes, indeed, sir.
Okay, well, my last real crazy one for you here is that I do find all this fascinating. I really like radical ideas, and the better case we can make, the better, of course.
Of course.
Let me ask you about the Earth itself. Much of our ideas about its composition come from theories about gravity. This is why we are supposed to have a dense, solid iron core, at least to my understanding. But do you see the Earth's composition as being different in any significant way from the traditional model?
Well, again, a perfect question. And I don't even think that Walt Thornhill or others more familiar with plasma environments in our group would hazard too many guesses about the nature of the interior of the Earth, because there are so many unknowns.
That's true.
I mean, in terms of plasma science and bodies evolving in plasma environments, the Earth could actually be hollow at its core.
Yeah, that's the golden word I was waiting to hear.
Okay, but don't go calling me a hollow Earth guy.
I know.
I pity you, but no, okay. It's just that we don't know. And one thing about plasma accretion accretion in a vacuum chamber is that it can be much less dense at the center of an electric discharge in plasma than some distance from that center, just as temperatures go up with distance from the center and so on. So when thinking about the plasma qualities of the Earth and possibly the interior of the Earth, you're in a completely different world than conventional science. But it is still a world largely unknown.
Yeah, I figured that was a worthy question because as a comparative mythologist, as a guy who's looked at a lot of ancient accounts, there are some that talk about cavities in the earth, or, I mean, you can look at the Vedic texts. They have some interesting accounts for the earth's composition.
Okay, but Greg, I'm sorry, I have to be careful on this. I just have to, in this instance, be really careful to make sure that I don't leave a misinterpretation here.
Right, of course.
I've looked at the ideas of this primeval enclosure or opening, and when I take those ideas back to the beginnings, they had to do with the enclosure of the gods. It wasn't a part of our planet here on Earth. It's an opening created by a toroidal form that is the boundary of the celestial kingdom. So it's always this enclosure or opening, or whatever the language might be. It fed a tremendous amount of mythology that got confused with the mythology of Earth, because the words for that celestial enclosure became our words for land and earth in later times. So this is an evolution of language over time that feeds a great deal of misunderstanding. But if you go back to the general features in this story of the primeval enclosure, you'll see it's always the land of the gods.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of a matter of perspective. Like, we were on the inside when you're talking about the enclosure.
Yes.
Gotcha. It's very interesting. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Hollow Earth idea. Of course, I'm just an idiot college dropout who has no idea if it has any validity. But when I hear, I mean, like I said, the composition of the Earth is based largely on density and gravity. And here we are talking about other forces. So
yeah,
it opens up some doors for sure.
Yeah, indeed so. So I'm with you on that. I just would ask that people not associate me with the Hollow Earth concept as it's presented normally.
Absolutely.
And I have looked at all of that. I never want to leave behind some possibilities that might be worth exploring. So I spend more time than people would know following the more exotic ideas with an openness of mind, actually. And I think it's important that in this day and age, where there's going to be a revolution in the sciences and in theory, that we make openness we put a premium on openness, eagerness to be corrected where correction is called for.
Mm-hmm.
This is a mantra that we should carry forward in life.
Amen. Well, yeah, I guess that pretty much brings us to the end of the road. I thought this was a lot of fun. I think we covered a lot of ground and made a pretty compelling case. It's impossible to cover it all in just one show, but is there anything major that we didn't touch on that you'd like to squeeze in maybe?
Well, we have a conference, Electric Universe 2016. It's June 17th to 19th in Phoenix. Now, if anyone listening to this finds a point of interest in this diverse subject matter, go to thunderbolts.info.
Right.
Because you'll see a huge library of evidence bearing on the themes of this discussion and taking you to much greater detail. Follow Space News from the Electric Universe that is published regularly on our YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. Take a look at the documentaries that are listed on our website, thunderbolts.info. The material is substantial, it's all fact-based, and it's very persuasive for those who will actually take the time to hear the message. That's been our experience.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, thunderbolts.info is the website. It will take you days to get through everything on there. Lots of information. I love it. And also your books as well. People should check them out too. So,
oh, yes. All of that information and videos and so on are linked from our website. So that makes an excellent starting point. Thunderbolts.info.
Beautiful. Well, thanks again, Dave, for doing this. I had a blast. Take care of yourself out there, all right?
Okay. Thank you, sir. Greg?
You got it.
Later.
And boom goes the dynamite, people. There we have it. David Talbott. Super nice guy. Really does great work. Hope you liked that one. I've heard a lot from David over the years, and I'm pretty familiar with his work, and I know a large part of the audience is familiar with the electric universe model too, so I wanted to ask a few random questions at the end there about the moon, about dying in space, and of course, the possibility of a hollow Earth. And I'm glad I did, because I don't hear Dave comment on those things very often. And I like the idea that those ancient accounts describing an inner and outer world could actually be allusions to Dave's polar configuration setup. That's really interesting too, so I think that was a great answer. Maybe this Saturn-Sun switch was part of the great cataclysm we hear echoed in the ancient past. Maybe the Ice Age was the period between suns. That could make sense if, like Dave said, civilization as we know it came right out of the wake of the catastrophe. Maybe it was a catalyst for such an ice age. And maybe that Saturn-Sun switch is the source of the occult themes that involve Saturn and the symbolism we see coming out of the Hollywood machine today. I don't know, but it is a compelling possibility, and I just don't know enough about anything really to wrap my head around how we could logically explain that switch and how Saturn ended up where it is now. I can see a paradigm where systems tend to self-correct. Dave talked about that. And listeners of this show, I think, could see parallels with Hadibov's Ebrov invasion and the movement of massive celestial bodies in the solar system. And the lack of ancient references to the moon is also interesting in that context. And just consider what we know about things like the Nazi bell or the work of Tesla from this perspective. I think it fits together pretty nicely. Another piece of evidence I saw on thunderbolts.info I forgot to bring up was Ceres. Remember the stories about strange lights on Ceres? What if that was some type of electrical static charge or something creating that light? I could buy that. I also like how this all could tie in with electromagnetism and UFOs and free energy. I think the electric universe is swept under the rug for the same reason all these other things are. Removing the quarantine around these things would be like giving the prisoners the keys to the cell. I think the energy implications are what they're trying to keep from us. The off-the-books physics Joseph Farrell talks about, also connected. And I do think at lower levels, there is a lot of what Dave described as the momentum of prior belief. Man, what a great term. Beautiful. I think there's a lot of that out there. But in my skeptical stoner mind, I can't help but speculate that there's a more calculated and sinister reason modern science wouldn't recognize electrical forces as a big deal if it's so obvious, and instead why they focus solely on its byproduct, gravity. It's setting up academia with a faulty map. They love to do that. But these are my words, not Dave's, and I don't want to drag him down to my ridiculous level. Either way, he's a great guy, fascinating body of work, and I think it incorporates very nicely into the bigger picture of the themes we talk about. And thanks for listening. In the Plus Show, we get even deeper into aspects of the electric universe, more about the timing of this and the catastrophe, dinosaurs, reasons for a cover-up, free energy connections, fire-breathing dragon myths, and more. All great stuff. You know the drill. Sign up at thehighersidechatsplus.com to get a second hour of this show and every show. Thanks to the Plus people for keeping me going and the forum users for the suggestions and the conversations about the electric universe that really made me move Dave up to the top of the list a bit faster than I might have otherwise. Please join Plus if you haven't already, and that is it for me this week. Your move, keepers of the Saturnian Saturn secret. Your frickin' move.
I put a spell on you because you're mine. The higher side spell on you. Watch out, I ain't lying.
As you mop up the remnants of your melted mind, consider this: the high-quality, commercial-free show you just enjoyed is what we call THC-free. But you can spend twice as much time with Greg Carlwood and all his great guests by becoming a member of the Higher Side Chats Elite for just $5. And you'll get the 5 extended 2-hour episodes that come out each month. Because an honest, open-minded, and uncensored exploration into the fringe will never be brought to you by your corporate overlords, but rather must be funded by the loyal listeners willing to take that ride. So join at thehighersidechatsplus.com, and on top of twice as much show, get your own easy-to-use RSS feed URL for convenient listening on any device. Suggest guests on your member profile, comb through the archives of all the ones you missed, and continue the conversation even further on the new THC Plus forum, where you can scratch that higher side itch in between shows with the rest of us and hold your head up high, knowing that your subscription supports a show you love, produces the free version for everyone else, and stands as a small act of rebellion against those nefarious puppet masters of the power pyramid. Treat yourself. It's time.